Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 4th of October 2024. Bear in mind that I haven't done a mapping update since the 30th of September, so this is 4 days of change. Think about that when we see the amount of territory that has changed hands. Also, I did the mapping update last night, so it is already somewhat out of date. It's fairly dynamic in a number of places. And also, I've just realised I have, since the Kursk incursion, I've been mapping the Kursk area incorrectly compared to the rest of the map with regard to Andrew Perpetua's mapping. Let me explain. So if you don't know what the lines on my map mean, forget the yellow one because we're not doing deep tech map at the moment. But as it stands, I'm synthesizing two mappers together. Yellow lines now, at the moment, refer to the fortifications built by the Russians, and you can see that they kind of go throughout the Kursk incursion area, and in fact that is what is being utilized by the Ukrainians themselves at the moment, but I'll take that off the map just for now. Now, normally my blue and red lines refer to the Russian defensive lines all over the front line. So for example, in this Vovchansk area, the blue line refers to where Andrew Perpetua thinks the Russian defensive line is. And the red line refers to where Suryat Maps thinks the Russian defensive line is. Anywhere in front of that, depending on which direction we're talking about, anywhere in front of that will be a grey zone until you've got a Ukrainian defensive line somewhere around here. So I don't have the Ukrainian defensive line, the grey zone, and the Russian defensive line, because with two mappers, that'd be 6 different lines and colours and whatnot. So it gets rather confusing. So I just have the Russian defensive line, and that is where the Russians are robustly in control of. There's very often a difference because Suryat Maps thinks that the Russians control anywhere where they have a human being or have had a human being and have had a piece of mechanized equipment. So there's often a difference between the two. Now, up in the Kursk region, I have been doing it wrong because my blue line here is the Ukrainian defensive line. This is interesting in itself because actually it shows a massive difference between what Andrew Perpetua and what Suryat Maps think. So Andrew Perpetua has the Russians pushed back further than the blue line here. So this is where the Ukrainians are fully in control. Suryat Maps says this is where the Russians are fully in control. So you can see there's just a massive difference of opinion as to what is going on here. If I was to do in this region like for like, the Russians line would actually be further back here, which indicates a huge difference. So what I'm going to do today is update that. I can't believe I've been doing that and I hadn't noticed. So in this area, the blue and the red lines signify two different things. The blue line signifies a Ukrainian defensive line as according to one mapper, and the red line refers to the Russian defensive line as according to the other mapper. So I do apologise for that. Right, these two pins here signify a grey zone. No shift in the defensive lines here. So the Russians have been pushed out of this area between the border and the Seine River. So remember, the Seine River comes down here and doglegs across here and then comes down there. We have the Ukrainians taking control of this area because it was too difficult for the Russians to maintain any presence there really, other than, I guess, civilian presence. So the Russians have given up control over this area, but the Ukrainians appear to have shifted their activity across the river here at Otruba and up into Tekhino. So this whole area here is a grey zone, as fighting must be taking place in the south of Tekhino and also across the river there. Okay, when we come further to the east, we see that the Russians, according to Andrew Perpetua, the Ukrainians robustly control half of Veseloya. According to Suryat Maps, the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back south, and the Russians themselves control half of Veseloya. With regard to Andrew Perpetua, he has all of this area as a grey zone there. So a big difference there. Russians possibly pushing back in that neck of the woods. And then when we come to the main Kursk salient, we have the Russians pushing back in one northern area here, taking back control of a sort of gully system and Otradnoye there. and Andrew Perpetua having the Russians themselves taking back control of just a little bit of land south of Kamyshovka, or at least pushing the Ukrainians back, because of course this is the Ukrainian line. Interestingly, in the same area, Surat Maps has the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back there. So who knows? That's why I say it's dynamic. But bear in mind that those lines are not like-for-like lines of the two mappers there, and that is my bad. Big apologies over that. So we look at Kursk. Here's what the Dead District says. So Ukrainians are liberated, and this admittedly is from a day and a half ago. Ukrainians are liberated 11.3 square kilometers near Tetkino. So that's where I'm talking about. So this is what Andrew Perpetua has admitted is grey zone. Actually, Dead District says that the Ukrainians are taking back control there, and also further to the east on the way towards, I presume that's going to be the Glushkovko area, taking control of some land there. Glushkovko. Some success for the Ukrainians south of the same river there. This is what Noel reports is idea of what's going on in the Kursk region is. As you can see, it really is quite dynamic, with both sides pushing in different places. So if you imagine, this is the same river coming down there, going across there, and we have the Ukrainians pushing up to Glushkovko there, and Medvedje, I think it is there, pushing, trying to take the Russians in the rear there. If we go further to the west, you've got Tetkino, doesn't have that on the map. And in the main Kursk salient, we have the Ukrainians pushing north in two areas, and also towards the east in one part of the salient on the east, but the Russians pushing towards the west on that, just south of that same sector. So interesting. And of course, the Russians pushing towards the east from the area, I wouldn't say beneath the same river because it comes down here, but south of Korinovo, they're pushing in that sector. So on my map, that would be the Russians pushing here, also pushing there. So maybe trying to cut the whole salient off at the base, with the Ukrainians still pushing up in the north and towards the northeast as well as pushing down from the south. So it'd be interesting to see if the Russians are trying to actually close off the cauldron, but I think that's probably a little bit too much to ask of them. The Ukrainians are using JDAMs. Here's an example of a building being completely destroyed by a JDAM in the Kursk region. So some intention from the Ukrainian aviation as much as there is from Russian aviation. There is a claim that the Russians are heavily using their own guided glide bombs in the area as well. There are some saying that they are making, this is supposedly, some of the most fertile Russian pastures, this kind of area, and they're bombing the crap out of it. That is one dynamic to take into account. So that's a Kursk region. I just wanted to point out my mapping mistake there. Now let's just look at some general claims about what's going on. I talked about this the other day. This is how much Russia has advanced in a year. For a country of their military might, it's nothing. Really, second greatest army in the world. 2.5 years. At this point in the war, they are just crawling along, taking some fields. Yes, some significant land has just been taken in the last few months, but then again, the same can be said for Ukraine. So that kind of balances, each of those are sort of balanced out. The Russians having some net gains over the year, but it is really underwhelming when you think about it. So I think that's definitely worth bearing in mind. And in fact, if we go to the Institute for the Study of War, and Euromaidan Press and others are talking about this paragraph here from the ISW, the American military think tank, the Russian offensive effort in eastern Ukraine that began in the autumn of 2023 continues to produce a gradual Russian tactical gains in specific sectors of the front, but operationally significant gains will likely continue to elude Russian forces. So what that means, remember, tactical is whether, the tactics of taking that hill. If we take that hill, then we can overlook that village and we can get some advantage over taking that village. Operational is, okay, what's going on in the whole region? Tactical would be in the Kursk area. Well, how are we going to take this village here of Pushkarnoye? Like, if we take this hill over there, then can we do that? Operational is, okay, what's going on in this whole area? by taking that, how will that affect that tactical victory there and taking that village? How will that affect what we're doing operationally? Will it allow us to get some logistics here to facilitate taking more ground in this whole operation that's going on there? And then strategic is, okay, how will that affect? What are our considerations about how we conduct the entire war? Will victories in this operational district cause Russia to draft forces in from abroad? How does that affect their international strategy? Is conscription going to be effective? Those are your kind of more strategic elements of fighting this war, the economy, etc., etc. So we're talking more about the tactical and operational here with regard to the Institute for the Study of War. So they are having tactical gains in specific sectors of the front, but operationally, significant gains will likely continue to elude Russian forces. So in other words, Pokrovsk is not really a significant operational gain. It hasn't quite tipped over into being a massive sort of victory for the Russians in that area. Ukrainian forces are conducting an effective defense in depth along the front line, inflicting significant losses upon Russian forces while slowly giving ground, but preventing the Russian military from making more rapid gains on the battlefield. Ukrainian forces do face serious operational challenges and constraints, which are providing Russian forces with opportunities to pursue tactically significant gains. So that would be Pokrovsk, Vuhledar, perhaps Toretsk and New York. Russian forces do not have the available manpower, and this is the bit that people are keying into here. They do not have the available manpower and material to continue intensified offensive efforts indefinitely, however, and current Russian offensive operations in eastern Ukraine will likely culminate in the coming months, if not weeks, as Ukrainian officials and ISW have previously assessed. Now that's interesting, because when we get down to the Eastern Front, we'll have a discussion about whether they are making those significant tactical gains still, or whether they are in the throes of culminating. Right, Radu Hosu, who gives his analysis of all of the front line, looks at two areas. Well, he looks at the whole kind of strategic state of affairs as well. We won't go into that. We'll just look at Kursk. The first Putin-imposed deadline passed without success by October the 15th. The third and final one, the Russians will fail to liberate Ukrainian-controlled territory, but these deadlines arbitrarily imposed by Putin have zero relevance to fighting on the ground. In other words, this was supposed to have been taken back by October the 1st. It wasn't. He kept moving. I think it was even before that. Then it's changed to October the 1st. Now it's changed to October the 15th, and it's looking unlikely that that will come to pass, which is a failure of the Russians there. The Russians have been trying for over a week to develop an attack vector on the eastern flank of the Ukrainian operation. At the moment, their advance is modest in this sector. It goes on to talk about Vuhledar also falling. After years of resisting Russian invaders, what was once a town of 14,000 people has fallen. Ukrainian units retreated, and well, they did, north of the town. Now, some people criticizing that, saying actually it was too expensive for the Ukrainians. I don't know. I think operational withdrawals are the most difficult maneuvers, and if it doesn't turn into an outright rout with a loss of significant numbers of people and material, then you've probably done a fairly decent job. Now, it's worth noting that these are 10 a penny, these sorts of montage videos, but here's one of stuff getting destroyed in Kursk, and an awful lot of stuff. So there is a fairly significant amount of equipment being lost, actually on both sides up in Kursk. The Ukrainians have lost more than the Russians in Kursk in terms of verified pieces of equipment. That's unsurprising, because this was a Ukrainian offensive. If you think of the offensive in Pokrovsk, the Russians have lost 5 times as much equipment as the Ukrainians. Here, the Ukrainians are about, I think, is it 1.3 to 1, something like that. So it isn't a huge amount of difference between the two, especially as the Russians are now counter-attacking in a number of places, and that will mean that they will lose a fair bit of equipment. No change to either of the Kharkiv sectors there. It's been fairly good news coming out from the center of Vovchansk. Ukrainians have been pushing the Russians back there. They've taken back control over the aggregates plant, but the Russians are hammering the whole kind of area with guided glide bombs, which is what they tend to do, isn't it? Right, then we come down to the Sinkivka area on the way to Kupiansk. No change there. Indeed, the ISW report from last night says no geolocated evidence of change across the whole of this axis. But there are claims from some of the mappers. So Surat Maps has, that should be a dark, that should be mauve. So the Russians have taken basically that triangle of land there, just south of Pischani, nothing too serious. And then coming out of the Zherelna area, Kolomerchivka, Russians pushing to the west, taking a few fields there. That's not an area we've seen much change recently. It's sort of north of Ryarodka. I don't know if you remember some of these places. Novovodyanye. This was where they had pushed. We had Nadia, Sahivka. There's another one just around there. Not Novoherivka as well. There it is, Novoherivka. So this was where the Russians did a fairly successful attack out the blue and took sort of something like 6 kilometers of land, and then the Ukrainians counterattacked and it stabilized. But actually, since then, we've had this really significant attack towards the Oskil River that the Ukrainians have struggled to contain, but it seems to have slowed down over the last week. And then sort of bits and pieces all up and down this front line. For example, in the Makivka-Nevska area, we have the Russians this is Makivka, gaining some ground to the west of Makivka. Andrew Perpetua's Russian, this is where we've got like for like. So this is a Russian defensive line, and this is the Russian defensive line as according to Surat Maps. There's a really big difference there. I don't know why there would be such a huge difference in interpretations of the mapping for both the mappers there, but there is. And then coming down to Nevska, the Russians having some success in taking more land around there. So it's interesting. There's this bit that kind of this whole thin salient that Andrew Perpetua has that the Russians control, whereas Surat Maps has much greater control there. If I turned off Andrew Surat Maps, you'd see that you've got this very different state of affairs being indicated between the two mappers. Okay, anyway, coming down south, no change around Serebiansky Forest, Terny Torska. That's been pretty stable for a long time now. Interesting that we are seeing some changes, at least according to Surat Maps, around the Verkhnokamianska and Verkhnokamianka towns, where the Russians are moving between one and the other, gaining some ground, moving towards the west. Again, though, that's just Surat Maps. No confirmation there from Andrew Perpetua. Really fascinating for me that Chasiv Yar has been as stable as it has been. This was supposed to be the big kind of target for the Russians over this time period before October. That was supposed to have been taken by the end of summer, Chasiv Yar. And of course, it's nowhere near that. The Russians arguably still the other side of the canal, although Surat Maps would have it that they control areas to the west of the canal, more likely grey zone, but there's a difference between the mappers, and quite a bit of difference still between the mappers around the Klishivka area and Ivanivska areas. But yeah, that the Russians haven't taken that probably indicates that they weren't really planning on having all of this success around, Avdiivka fell, didn't it, rather quickly, and the Russians opportunistically took advantage of that. Also, there's that tunnel situation where they were able to come up behind the Ukrainians around the New York area, and that has meant that they've been able to they've concentrated on these areas because they've been more successful, and actually Chasiv Yar's just taken a back seat. And then when you've had the Ukrainians attacking up in Kursk, no doubt troops from along the front line have been taken to support the defense of Kursk, and that means that places like Chasiv Yar have remained fairly stable. Right, Surat Maps shows that, or claims that, there have been some fairly significant gains for the Russians. I say fairly significant though, this is 4 days, and there's a much smaller set of gains than we've previously seen. So my opinion on the Eastern Front is actually that things have slowed down. We could be seeing the beginnings of a culmination. I've been saying, goodness me, how long can the Russians keep going? How sustainable is this? But of course, as the Russians get thoroughly attrited and are losing hand over fist, material and troops, The Ukrainians are, and they're not losing it to the degree that the Russians are losing it. But of course, they start out with less, and it's, the Russians are up here, the Ukrainians down here, right? The Russians are losing massive amounts, the Ukrainians are losing smaller amounts, but actually, that's a smaller. It's still probably the same kind of percentage of what they started with as the Russians are losing. So it's significant, and that allows the Russians have fewer resources, but they can they can continue to attack against the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians have fewer resources, having been attrited. So, had the Ukrainians not lost any and the Russians were getting attrited at this kind of rate, you'd think they're going to start culminating now because they're against the same amount of Ukrainians, but actually because they're both going down, even though in real terms the Russians are losing many more, in percentage terms they're going down the same amount, and that allows the Russians to still continue to attack. Possibly, that's my speculation. Okay. But yeah, Toretsk, the Russians moving further into Toretsk, into the center of Toretsk, and Andrew Perpetua actually only has these kind of buildings here as what the Russians have taken control of. Completely different appraisal as to what's going on there than Surat maps. But there you go. Then further to the south, coming out of New York, northern New York, moving along the railway line here towards Shebnyivka, we have the Russians taking control of a few more areas, not too significant, just a little bit of this railway line and a few fields there, a few houses. Then when we come down to the main cross front line, first of all, it's worth noting that this northern area just hasn't changed for an awful long time. And actually this northwestern area has changed very little. Even when we're talking about Mykolaivka, which is I think this village here, we have only just, a couple of roads of village houses and maybe a bit of a gully there or tree line there that the Russians have taken. Bit of a difference between the two mappers there, but it's not massively significant. When we come down further to the south, it looks like a lot of pins there, draw an imaginary line. That's the amount of land they've taken, but it is just a few fields in 4 days. That is a slowing down, I think, personally. And then a lot of the gains are happening around further to the south of Seladova, where we see the Russians making some more significant gains. It's Ukrainsk, isn't it? And that tailing spoils heap there. The Russians gaining quite a bit. Andrew Perpetua catching up somewhat with what Surat Maps had previously claimed in this area south of Ukrainsk. So he has the Russians now controlling all of this area that they didn't previously control. Surat Maps already had that under the Russian control and has now extended the control a little bit further to the southwest, taking control of Nekhorovka and Sukurina there, if I've pronounced them even remotely correctly. So as you can see, important railway logistics potentially, and they are using the railway lines often to move up. Not so much that you use the actual railway, but they're like de facto roads that you can easily drive tanks and whatnot up and down, and you can get supplies in fairly easily. So railways are useful even if you're not using the actual rail. So that is where the Russians are having most of their success in the Pokrovsk area at the moment. They are grinding on. That is 4 days worth of gains. But if you're thinking, if you're trying to compare that to what was happening when it was at its worst stage around here, that is, I think they've slowed down, and I think they've been somewhat halted around here, and that's broadly, as far as I can work out, because this is where the main defensive trenches are for the Ukrainians. They have stopped at the Ukrainian trench lines there. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, what continues to happen in this sort of area. Seladove seems to be holding out somewhat. And then we have the move towards Karakova, where the Russians are, both mappers agreeing that the Russians are moving somewhat. A little bit of difference between the mappers there, but the Russians are moving closer and closer to Karakova and up to this river now, and they'll move, no doubt, along the south. And this is a key sort of area for them, a key target for them, and long has been. But yeah, Surat Maps claiming that the Russians have made some pretty significant gains. So this was where the Russians previously had a very thin line that included this, And that thin line went over here and then came down there in a weird kind of like an axe head. So it went like that. Now they've kind of filled all that in over here. So quite some gains there over the last 4 days. That's quite significant because, you know, it's all about Karakova. So this is one to watch out for now. And of course, we know about Vuhledar. In and of itself, Vuhledar is like meaningless, as in it's a bunch of destroyed buildings. So there's no intrinsic value to Vuhledar. There is some extrinsic value, which means like it's useful in order to do other things. And what this was useful for was keeping the Russians at bay, so you could have HIMARS here to then hit down to Mariupol, because that's just in HIMARS range. If you take Vuhledar, then it then becomes not in HIMARS range. So that's 90 kilometers. And when I say HIMARS range, I'm talking about the 84 kilometers version thereof. So you start taking all this area, then of course that's then pushing back your HIMARS to somewhere like this, and it's out of range for those kind of missiles. It's also useful for hitting areas like Volnovakha, which is a bit of a hub. It's a rail. That's where the railway goes through with artillery. So the artillery has been particularly effective around Vuhledar, and now you're starting to have to push that much further back and out of standard artillery range. Whereas, you know, previously you were able to just about, you know, hit Volnovakha with your standard howitzers and whatnot. So, you know, there is that's the value of this kind of area, and it potentially unlocks a key to this whole sort of front line area down here and losing Karakova. But then, you know, when you zoom out, you think, okay, you just have to start moving hubs further back, and it comes, you know, seems that places like Konstantinopel will become the new kind of hub to supply this kind of front line. And if that then goes, and it moves back and back. And sometimes we fixate on certain areas and certain towns and think, oh my God, Vuhledar's gone after 2 years, and woe is the Ukrainians. But actually, no, okay, we'll set up shop. I mean, eventually, of course, you want that to stop, because you can't just do that infinitely, because then you lose a whole country. But at the moment, losing some of this ground is okay, as long as I keep saying, the Russians are losing troops at a rate that is unsustainable to continue with their maximalist goals. And I think that is certainly the case. Anyway, that's it for the front line. I was just going to show you, this is Toretsk, and I could do this for Vuhledar, for Avdiivka, of course, you know, any Vovchansk. These cities are just being rubberized, and it's an indication of what Russia means by liberation. They're not interested in liberating. They're not interested in the people of Ukraine. They're interested in what Ukraine can get them. They just have imperialistic intentions. They might try and dress it up with, we're one people, you know, you are our Slavic brothers, or whatever they might say. Of course, if you really felt that, you wouldn't be murdering the civilians in the way that you are. So, you know, give over. That is the sad tale of Toretsk, and you know, we've seen that so often, as I've said. Now, this is Zelensky saying lives are more important than buildings when talking about the Vuhledar withdrawal, and absolutely. He said the decision to withdraw from Vuhledar was absolutely correct, as it helped save the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. Some critics of Zelensky have levelled that actually it happened too slowly. The Ukrainians should have pulled out previously, you know, much quicker, and it would have saved more lives. And we hear this every time there's an operational withdrawal from somewhere. And Zelensky always seems to get the blame for, or Syrsky, for holding on to places much longer than they need to have done. I don't know. It's very difficult. It's easy for me to sit in an office in the south coast of the UK and cast those kind of opinions without the knowledge surrounding what's exactly going on there. You'll always have people complaining on the ground about decisions being made because they don't necessarily have the bigger picture view. But that's not to insulate Zelensky or his military leaders from criticism. I think bad decisions have been made and will continue to be made. This is war. If you look at the Second World War and the Allies, goodness me, like whole hosts of terrible decisions were made, and yet the Allies still prevailed. and everyone thinks, oh, how wonderful the Allies were in the Second World War, generally speaking. But actually, some truly horrendous decisions were made that cost the lives of thousands and thousands of people unnecessarily. So you can't expect the Ukrainians to be operating perfectly all the time. It's just insanely unrealistic. Wars are dirty, dangerous, difficult places with all sorts of variables, and sometimes you make bad decisions. I make bad decisions on a weekly and monthly basis, but that mainly affects what I bought from the supermarket and whether I've got the right insurance on my car, right? Whoop-de-doo. That doesn't result in people dying. So my bad decisions, we all make bad decisions. It's just like, when your bad decisions involve the death of people, then the criticisms are obviously far, far greater. And that also means you have to be much more careful with your decision making. But if you're careful and cautious in war, then you're overly cautious, and that itself can end up in leading to unnecessary losses, etc., etc. So, just war is difficult, and it's very easy to cast opinions when you don't have the requisite information. Anyway, hopefully that was of use for you and informative. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate your support, and I'll sort out my mapping up in Kursk. When you have a brain that's just full of so much stuff, as mine is on a daily basis, mistakes get made. There you go. There's an example of mistakes getting made. Anyway, take care, guys. Speak soon.